A new study has revealed some commercial banks in Ghana could face liquidity issues with the new cash reserve requirements placed on them by the Bank of Ghana. The research comes after the central bank decided to raise the amount of cash reserve it expects from banks. According to the study, the situation could limit credit to private sector and ultimately result in the collapse, merger and acquisition of commercial banks as a measure to safeguard depositors' funds. We've been joined by the two researchers who came out with these findings. Dr. Richmond Atuahene is banking consultant and co-authored this with Joy News lead data and research analyst Isaac Kofi Ejay. Kofi, let me start with you though. What data formed the basis of this research? Hello, Kofi, if you can hear me. Go ahead.
Yeah, I can hear you. Well, so 30 banks, we are looking at key data that inform this research. So we've been looking at banks. One is their non-performing loans of bank, which we've been studying the data for a while. And we've seen how it is increased from somewhere around 15% to now 24.6%. Essentially, if you have banks that non-performing loans exceed 20%, we definitely would term it as an industry that is actually in crisis. The next data that we looked at is the the DDEP that took place about less than 2 years ago, where banks sacrificed more than $50 billion of their investment, depositors' monies that they use to buy government instruments, which were restructured and sort of rendered some of the banks illiquid as a result of that activity that the Bank of Ghana carried out. Now, if you look at the debt exchange that happened, it did two things. First, it sort of rendered the banks illiquid, and two, it created a problem for the banks where they found it very, very difficult to now lend to the private sector. And we've seen the activities of the central bank in the short term.
It appears Kofi Ejay has some challenges, but let me come to Atuahene now. Yes, I think there were some hitches in your communication, but you can conclude before I go to Atuahene.
So I was talking about the activities of the central bank in the T-bill market, where because government can no longer borrow from bonds market and can't also borrow from the international capital market, they are now looking at borrowing almost all, about more than 90% of government's, the monies they will use to finance this 2024 budget deficit. Everything is being borrowed from the T-bill market, and that is actually pricing down the private sector. And how is government doing this? Government is doing this using very lucrative and attractive coupon rates or interest rates. Previously was more than 30%. It's now that has been reduced somewhere between 24 and 27%. And so we've seen the activities of the central bank in the capital market, especially in the T-bill market. The fact that non-performing loans have risen above 24%. And then also the effects of the DDEP. That was what actually informed us, or led us to look closer to the liquidity positions of the banks, and we came out with this research findings, of which I know Dr. Atuahene will speak more about.
Right. Thank you, Isaac. Now, Dr. Atuahene, what exactly is this cash reserve ratio that commercial banks have to meet?
Thank you very much, and good morning to your cherished viewers and listeners. The cash ratios are just, the banks are expected to keep a certain percentage of your money with the central bank. It can either be in the form of cash, it can be form of treasury bills. So every 100 cedis you collect, before the changes, the banks were expected to keep 15% locked up. It is locked up. You don't have access to lend. And the unfortunate thing is that this money, it doesn't bear any interest for the banks. Whereas the banks have gone to borrow source money from customers where they will possibly pay in 10%. And that bit of it, the 15% of the 100 cedis will be locked without interest. But meanwhile, the bank would have to pay interest. That is, and we, Bank of Ghana do this to stem up inflation. It is all used in globally. You keep the reserves to monitor inflation and also look at your currency depreciation. And this is not the first time Ghana has used this policy. We've used it since 1957 and 1960s and the 1980s. But it became prevalent in 1980s when the financial sector reform was introduced, where the country was introduced to what we call indirect monetary policy, where you have the cash reserve, you have the open market operations, you have the bill discounting, and then you have what we call the repurchasing agreement, where banks can go and get finance. So it is not a new thing that we have. But what we have now, it looks a bit curious. Like Kofi said, after going through a stringent DDP, where the bank's bonds, 50 billion, 50.6 billion to be exact, has been restructured with payments, possibly final payment due somewhere in 2031. And these monies, any bank, and I want to state it here clear, the deposit which were used for the banks buying the bonds were customers' deposit. It wasn't the banks per se. No bank will have, one bank had 10 billion to buy bonds. No, it was customer deposit for which they structured in a way to buy the bonds. So when the bonds were restructured, it had a serious implication on the deposit, banks making deposit. Because if people walk in today and they want their deposit, bank would have to find money somewhere to pay the bonds that have been restructured. So all these things have had a serious implications on the economy. But looking at what has just happened, I think whether it was oversight, when they were calculating the 224 billion deposit, they didn't take in consideration the 50 billion which has already been restructured, which is a deposit. So ideally, the governor or the whoever that did it should have taken the 50 billion from the 224. Because Kofi said, we pick all these data from Bank of Ghana. Every data that we have is from Bank of Ghana. We didn't quote any data. And when we look at the Bank of Ghana policy rate, the policy issue, they said that the banks are not lending money. And they seem to be doing what we call lazy bank approach. And when we say in finance, a lazy bank approach, what it literally means that you don't want to lend money to the private sector, but you want to lend money to government, because government has created an enabling environment. Like Kofi said, a lucrative business, 30%. And one time, right, it went to 33%. Now it's declining, but it's still the most attractive for the bank. So the governor said that because you are not lending, let me add this thing to you. Forgotten what has happened to the banks earlier. And again, like Kofi said, the non-performing in 2022, December, was 15%. As I speak to you, according to governor's own statement, it has hit 24.6%. And from the literature, if you read any literature, especially from Levine and Valencia, 2018, a paper done by IMF staff, any country, especially developing country, that has a non-performing more than 10, 20%, your banking sector is in serious trouble. So when we hear these statements, you begin to wonder, why did we find ourselves doing this without taking into consideration the non-performing, high non-performing, and at the same time, the bonds that were restructured in addition to the higher cash reserves. So that one influenced our thinking, saying that maybe somebody, we have to draw attention to the policymakers for them to realize that something has gone wrong, and maybe they will sit down and restructure it, taking into consideration of the bond that were restructured.
Right.
And to end my case, you see, the banks are not just in a charity, they are not in charitable organizations. No bank, they take deposit at cost. So if you tell me that I've taken a deposit an average of 20, 10, 15% or 10%, and I should come and keep 25% free while I pay interest, you're not being fair to the bankers. And I'm wondering why the Bankers Association or the bankers institutions in Ghana haven't spoken about this. And to end up my conversation, the the non-performing, what factors has influenced Ghana performing asset to have risen from 15% to 24%? I'm going to give you a quick answer. The microeconomic environment, number one, higher inflation, the persistent depreciation of the currency, the introduction of the myriad nuisance taxes, and also the unconducive business operation for banks. And I can tell you, if we don't take care, by the time we finish this program, we wouldn't have any private sector, because I don't see any private sector taking an overdraft or a loan at 30% in this microeconomic environment, because you're already saddled with high energy cost. What have you? Depreciation, high labor cost, everything. So we must be very careful. That is why we are putting up this paper, that we must revisit it and see if there is a way we can come together. And now the solution, quick solution. You know, we're talking about the Bank of Ghana using the monetary policy to control the issues. Nobody is talking about the fiscal policies. If you read the IMF document, the budget deficit, the financing, which is about 60-something billion, they're all coming from treasury bills. Are we not killing ourselves by making a conscious effort to reduce our expenditure? You know, in managing economy, we have the monetary policy which Bank of Ghana is doing. And then we have the fiscal policy which the finance ministry and the government should stick up to, which that place has been left unattended. And because of that, the burden is currently being shifted more to the banks, having suffered the DDEP. So that is what I'll say for the time being.
Right. Dr. Tiani, your submission has actually been very detailed, but I just wanted to shed more light on how these non-performing loans affect or impact the lending decision of banks.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. It's a very good thing, because a lot of people don't appreciate that. The more you have learned, if you have 24%, if you take 100 cedis from somebody and 25% go bad, it means you are constrained. You are constrained by that element. So you cannot lend further. And you wouldn't, any prudent banker like me, who has been a banker, a professional banker, I will not lend when my non-performing is high. I would prefer to take the softer spot by buying treasury bill, where you don't make any provision. Don't forget, immediately you lend 100 cedis. According to Bank of Ghana, we have provision, current, OLEM, doubtful, and losses. Each of them has its specific tag. Immediately you lend money, 1% will have to go as non-performing, because the possibility that you may not get the money is high. If there's about 90 days, you move to OLEM. That is another 10%, and then we'll go up to 100%. So the banks also sit down and realize that if we are going to collect people deposit and lend, and we cannot get the money back when they come to us, why don't we take the easy spot when you have treasury bills? That is why government has found it very easy to create enabling environment for the banks to do the lazy bank approach. So it is not the banks, because currently, if you ask the banks how much are they going to credit, everybody is watching cautiously, because the microeconomic environment, the business environment, is not conducive to lending. And because of the default they have, they cannot also recover it. Because if you go and the man tells you that you gave me money and my business cannot get the cash flows to pay you, or that you want to sell, if you sell the property or sell his business, you're not going to get anything. That is why we're going to experience this. And literature confirm what I'm saying. If you read any literature about non-performing, with its correlation with the banks cutting their lending, it is clear. The more you experience non-performing, the more you want to cut. The more you experience non-performing, the more you want to cut your lending to the private sector.
Right. Thank you so much, Dr. Tiahini, who is a banking consultant, for giving us that in-depth analysis and breakdown of what the literature means.